On Build Vocabulary with Retention Boosting Activities with our presenter, Susan McDonald. We are glad to have you all here this afternoon. I'm now going to turn it over to Susan.
Thank you, Jessica. Thanks all for being here today to participate and learn a little bit more about strategies and routines that you can use in the classroom. This with the goal of helping your students retain the vocabulary that you're trying to teach them. My intention for you for this webinar is to help you make sense of the different vocabulary activities and resources that you might have so that you're using them in a way that makes sense for helping students recall words and use them meaningfully in the different projects and class activities that you want them to do. So with that, I'm going to be giving you a framework of organizing those different types of activities, and I'm going to be giving you some ideas as well. But really the suggestions and ideas I'm presenting are really with the idea that you're going to modify them for your students, your content area, your classroom. You know, if you've been in the field for more than a couple of years, I'm sure you've gotten a lot of different types of vocabulary activities, and you may just want some, you know, some way to make sense of it all. So that's kind of the purpose of today, because it's going to help connect with different principles that we know about how kids learn best. And I come from a speech language pathology background. I've been a speech pathologist in the public schools for a long time. I also have English language teaching experience, and so I like to take the best of both of those worlds and come up with strategies and routines that make sense, that'll be really best for students to retain the words and vocabulary that you want them to use. So when we're thinking about vocabulary, it really is one of the most crucial parts of your curriculum, whether you're a social studies teacher or an English language arts or math or science. And unfortunately, though, for some students, learning vocabulary can kind of feel like this. And if you're looking at the slide here, you should see a big pile of magnetic words. And they're really kind of just a mess of words there that really don't have any connection to each other. And it's just kind of a random distribution. So for a lot of our students, especially the ones that might be English language learners or have speech and language impairments or learning disabilities, it can be a little overwhelming for them to have to learn a certain number of words by a certain designated time. We want to make sure that we're teaching them ways that are going to help them to develop what we call semantic networks in their brains. So we want to take this mess of words and help them organize it in something like this. And so I like this visual because it helps you kind of see all of the different connections between the words. And so that's really what we need to build in our students' brains, is these networking of neurons that connect all of the words together. And because words don't really exist in a vacuum, they exist in the presence of other words. So we have to teach them how to connect them. And we can do that using the different modalities of language. So there's 4 key language modalities or domains that we use when we're teaching language. And because, you know, as social studies teachers, science teachers, you're all teaching language, whether you know it or not. And so it's important to consider, how do we combine all of the language skills into our teaching, and providing opportunities for students to practice those skills. So the 4 key language modalities that we have are listening, speaking, reading, and writing. And I'm just going to touch on what they are. Listening skills refers to our ability to receive the words and sentences we're actually hearing and to make sense of them. So this part of the brain stores vocabulary in our memory in the left hemisphere of our brain. Speaking taps into our comprehension of language as we try to formulate a message. And it also relies on our speech and language motor system, also located in the left side of the brain. Now, reading requires comprehension of language as well as visual skills, because we're looking at those symbols, okay? So it's also tapping into the same language memory in the left side of the brain. Writing skills relies on a few different things: comprehension of language, our speaking skills, fine motor skills, and our visual system. So it's really one of the most complex skills that we can ask a student to do, is to write, because it pulls on so many different parts of learning. So when teaching vocabulary, we really want to have the student practice the vocabulary in all 4 modalities, which might seem really obvious if you've taken any English language teaching classes or have had some training in this. But what happens is a lot of times students get practice with the reading and writing of the vocabulary, but not so much with the speaking or the listening to it. And so one way that I think is a really great resource for putting this all together and keeping track of all of those pieces is vocabulary journals. And it's probably something that you've heard about before. It's not necessarily a new idea, but I want to talk about how you can use vocabulary journals as a reference point for lots of different activities that will incorporate meaningful ways that the student's learning the vocabulary and using the vocabulary. So a vocabulary journal or book would be an ongoing record of the student's progress as they are learning the vocabulary words. It would provide a vocabulary log where they're keeping track of all of the words that they've been learning. And it's a way that the teacher and the student can share the progress. And so the student can show how they're learning, and the teacher can check that learning in the vocabulary journal. So the great thing about this is all teachers can use this, any kind of content area teacher, English language arts, that kind of thing. So it's really with the idea that you're going to modify it for what works in your classroom and for different language learners. So one of the things that would be in the vocabulary journal would be a log of the vocabulary words. And I recommend that the teacher select a certain amount of vocabulary words depending on that child's language level. So if you have English language learners, their list of vocabulary that they're going to need to be responsible for is going to be very different than maybe your non-English language learners, people, kids that are developing typically and don't really need a lot of support with that. So I would choose maybe, if you're choosing maybe 30 words for the typically developing kid with who's not learning another language, then maybe 15 words for the English language learner or the student with speech language impairment. And you want to look at how abstract or concrete those vocabulary words are. So essentially in the log, they would write the word that was being assigned, and then they're going to write the meaning or definition of the word. And for this part, I don't want you to have them copy the word straight out from the dictionary. We want them to actually come up with words that are going to make sense to the student. So the teachers may want to prompt the student to think about, how would you explain this word to your neighbor? Or how would you explain this word to your younger brother or sister? So we want them to be able to use real words so that it's not going to be work for them to even understand the actual definition when they go back into their vocabulary logs. It should be something that makes sense. And then after that, we're going to ask them to write example sentences, which is definitely something that's pretty typical with all vocabulary work. And the reason, but this is a good thing, because we need to get the students to write the sentence using appropriate grammar skills and using the word appropriately, writing it with the right part of speech, and maybe including other related words into that sentence. So we want them to have at least 2 example sentences, and I'll show you an example in just a second, because we want them to have that initial sort of model of how you would use that word, because they're going to be doing lots more activities with it. This is just the starting point. And then lastly, we want them to include some kind of picture that they've drawn that represents the vocabulary word, or have some kind of picture that they've downloaded from the internet that represents that actual vocabulary word, that can help them recall it. Okay, so there might be something that's really going to help them connect with that vocabulary word. So let me give you an example of what I mean here. So in the vocabulary log, you should have the word, and I chose the word empire because it comes up a lot in social studies and world history classes. And so you can see the word there on the left. And then next to it is the meaning, the definition, and we define that as a group of lands and people under the control of one government. And then 2 example sentences. We have the Roman Empire was responsible for many achievements in civilization. And then the Persian Empire ruled over the Middle East and parts of Asia. And then to the far right, you can see that there's a picture of Darth Vader. And so I chose that because I think for some kids, the word empire is really a little abstract. It doesn't have a lot of relevance to their life. However, Star Wars does have an empire, the Galactic Empire, and that might be a nice way for them to connect to the vocabulary. We know that research shows when kids have an emotional connection to what they're doing, what they're learning, they're much more likely to retain it. So having something that they enjoy, maybe a Star Wars memorabilia, going to the movies, that might help them get more excited about what they're learning. And then you'll notice that there are there's a few lines down here where it says speaking activity, reading, and writing activity. And the students are directed to pick 2 from the list, okay? And so we're gonna get into this part next. Once they have their vocabulary log, they're ready to now work with this vocabulary and do some meaningful activities with it. So the way that I like to organize vocabulary is just thinking about the different modalities again. So they've listened to it, they've written about it, but we want to get more in depth with this vocabulary. And so I encourage you to think about, okay, did I come up with an activity for them to speak the vocabulary, read the vocabulary, and write the vocabulary? So if you did that, that's going to give them multiple opportunities to practice this in a way that makes sense to them, and it's connected to something bigger. We also know that research says when kids have it connected to prior background knowledge or a real experience, they're definitely much more likely to retain it and to recall. So the first activity I'd like to suggest is something called question and answer, and this is a Q&A. And basically, what the students would do is take a word from their log and they would design a question around it. So what I do recommend for students that are maybe having trouble comprehending certain vocabulary or need extra practice with it, that the teacher selects maybe some words that the student should be coming up with questions for, or they can give them a choice. So out of these 5 words, pick one right now that you want to practice with. So that gives the student a little bit of power to select the vocabulary that they want to learn more about, and the teacher gets to frame those opportunities. So when they get their word, they're going to come up with a question that they would be asking their classmates, okay? And that's in relation to the key curriculum vocabulary words that you've already had them write down in their logs. And so in groups of 3 or 4, they're going to take turns asking each other their questions. So I recommend before you get to that stage, though, the day before, have the student write up the question first to make sure that the grammar is correct and the word is being used right. That way you can work with them to revise it if they need to. And then that way they'll be asking it the right way when they're in their group the next day. So the next day when they've got their questions and they're in their groups, each student is going to go around and ask their classmates this question in that group. And so the cool thing about this is that they're going to ask this question and they're going to get 3 different answers from their classmates. So what they're going to do when they get those responses is they're going to write that down in their vocabulary journals. So they're getting speaking experience by having to compose a question and ask it. They're getting listening experience because they have to hear what their classmates responded with. And they're getting writing experience because they have to write down what the classmates said. And I encourage them to do that in complete sentences whenever possible. So there's a lot of different modalities that are activated with this activity. And the great thing about this from a speech pathology standpoint is that it really helps with social skills. We get the students to actually practice asking coherent questions, listening to the answers from their classmates, and processing that by writing it down. So it's really a nice social interaction. And then the other plus of this is that they get to review class content at the same time. So they get to recall information when the classmate asks them a question. So it's really a great all-around activity, and it shouldn't take, basically if they have one question per student, you don't want to do this for more than maybe 15-20 minutes. So they should be, after a while, this should be a routine kind of activity. You could have them do this one time a day or maybe every other day, depending on how often you see them. So it could be something that could be incorporated pretty easily into the class time. So here's an example of that. So the question that I came up with is really based on one of the sentences from the vocabulary log. So if we go back to the vocabulary log here, you can see that first sentence that says, the Roman Empire was responsible for many achievements in civilization. And then you can easily turn that into a question. What was one of the achievements of the Roman Empire? So that's an open-ended question that's going to get a lot of nice varied responses from the classmates. And so, for example, Juan would say, the biggest achievement of the Roman Empire was the development of running water in the cities. And so Alyssa's not going to be saying the same thing. She's going to come up with a different answer. And then Deshawn's going to come up with a different answer. So there's going to be a nice way of getting more content and more vocabulary practice in that. So the question and answers are really, as I mentioned, they incorporate listening, writing, and speaking for the most part in their in that actual activity. And then the next one is visual representation. So this is taking advantage of the student's right side of the brain. So if they maybe aren't so verbal, maybe you've got some English language learners or students with speech language impairments where they need a lot of prompting for verbal language, this is a nice way to kind of provide an alternative in addition to the other activities that they might be doing. So the visual representation would just really be any type of picture that the child has drawn or model that the student has created with the vocabulary words in mind. So they're going to select a vocabulary word, or maybe the teacher might say, okay, well, that idea would be good, but you need to incorporate 5 words into what your project is here. So they can decide with the teacher what would be appropriate in terms of number of vocabulary words. So basically the student's going to create a model, okay, based on the vocabulary word or draw a picture. So for example, you might have them drawing a map of the Roman Empire, or creating a model of the Roman Empire using like a topographical map sort of model. And then just like they would in a museum, you have those nice little summaries of what you're looking at. The students would need to come up with some kind of written summary or statement about what the viewer was looking at, and they would have to incorporate keywords into that short paragraph. So that would be something that would really help those that need to activate more of the visualization part of language learning, because maybe their left side of the brain is not as strong in terms of acquiring vocabulary. And the great thing about this one too is that the students are going to need to actually study up a little bit more. So they're going to need to get access to those primary and secondary sources for more information on a topic. So there you get the reading, so they get a little bit of research practice in there too. And then they have the writing practice. So you've got those 2 modalities that are incorporated into this any kind of visual activity. And I'm sure you all have lots of different things that you're already doing in your classes, and this could easily be incorporated into that. Lastly, I want to talk about performance activities. And I think this is one of the most powerful tools for students to really learn language, because it provides them with an opportunity to act out or do a dramatic reenactment of a major event that can represent a different concept or a whole theme. And this can incorporate lots of different vocabulary words. So it doesn't just have to be limited to one. You definitely can incorporate as much as you want in there. So some ideas for this would be if the student was given the name of a famous person connected to a historical event, they would need to come up with maybe a press release statement or a video about what happened. They could pretend that, you know, they were giving a real life, newscast on something that happened, in ancient times. So there's lots of different creative creative ways that students can use the vocabulary, and the teachers can guide this as much as they would like. It's really about coming up with a script or some kind of narrative and really incorporating the vocabulary into that. And again, that's something that can be really easily worked into other projects that you have in your classroom. Other things that are really helpful with this are debates. You could even debate which empire was greater, the Galactic Empire or the Roman Empire. So try to make it fun for them and engaging and connecting with their interests, because again, that's really going to help them to connect with the material and learn it a little bit more deeply. The great thing also about these performance-based activities is that they incorporate listening, reading, writing, and speaking. So they kind of check all the boxes with our language modalities and gives them lots of practice, because there's always a lot of rehearsal that's required with any kind of dramatic reenactment. So they get to hear that language over and over and over again, which is really what they need. They need a lot of repetitive practice, but in a way that's going to be fun for them. So I just want to summarize some of the main points from today's discussion. And I just want to make sure that, you really, when you're taking these vocabulary words, that you're thinking about including all 4 modalities in the opportunities you're giving the students to really learn the words. And so just thinking not just about listening and writing, but speaking and reading as well. We also want to make sure that we're developing connections between the words, giving the students some opportunities to self-select activities. So really the teacher can provide maybe 5 options, and then they have to choose maybe 2 or 3, depending on what time frame you're working with, from that, so that they can feel empowered and they're in charge of their learning. And that really goes into this next point about really wanting to make sure students are more accountable for their learning. We want to make sure that they understand what language that they need to use in the classroom, and that they're learning it and they're showing us. And so they're showing us through these different activities, which goes back to, in the vocabulary log, what activities how are they going to show us? And they need to show us through at least 2. And that way you'll know that you've done your job. You're really kind of giving them as much input as possible. And then lastly, just make it fun for them and incorporate things that are real for them. And that way you'll really truly maximize their learning and they'll really enjoy the process. So that concludes the webinar for today. Thank you so much for participating.